Welcome, everyone, and happy International Women's Day. As we begin, it is my honor to welcome Elder Sequoia from the Squamish Nation. She is here to say a few words to open this event in a good way. Thank you, Sequoia.
Kayachtan, I welcome each and every one of you to the ancestral traditional lands that you're zooming into of Squamish Nation, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. Happy Indigenous and International Women's Day to all of you. I welcome you and wish you all well in all the good work that you do as matriarchs of the present and for building the matriarchs of the future. I'm just going to share a bit of a song and then do a quick prayer and get you grounded for the good discussion you're going to have, and ask you all today to be in Chomo and Squawin every day, one heart and one mind, and to Chen Swite, stand and work together to hold each other up and help each other. So I'll ask you just to open your hands and take a breath while I sing, pray for each other and the good work that's going to be done during your time together today. Chen Quen Mentomi Kakakanak JCM Yonso Chanoyap and Manman Disquals Deceits Yonsio Manman Squalwin Yonsio Manman Equato Chet Squalwin Siaya Chet Squalwin Yonsio Manman Zaitop Snachum Disquals Deceits. Asking you, Creator, to watch over and guide and protect each and every one of your children gathered here today and all of their family, Equato Chet, and all their friends, Siaya Chet, and help them with their squalwin, their feelings in their hearts and minds, their emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual health and well-being. Asking you, Creator, to help each of your children gathered here today and those who are going to share Snachum words to be respectful and share the words, and will transfer knowledge and experiences and listen to the words, take into your heart what's meant for you today, set aside what you don't need to bring back another day, and to be able to share and transfer knowledge in a respectful way with each other and share experiences and ask questions. And asking you, Creator, to watch over all our families with serious illnesses, injuries, and surgeries with their health, healing, and recovery. Help, Creator, hear our prayers for all our family of traumas and battle alcohol and drugs, especially those who are homeless and those incarcerated are going to be released because the supply is dangerous with fentanyl and carfentanil taking many. So help, hear our prayers to help them find that healing path to wellness and recovery. Asking you, Creator, to hear our prayers for all our family who've lost loved ones and lift them up in their time of sorrow, and know that their loved ones are guardian angels watching over them, and send signs like a hummingbird or dragonfly that we believe is ancestors visiting, or an eagle, raven, something that makes you smile and lifts you up when you're feeling low. That's spiritual help from a loved one. So again, Creator, let today be a yet one halt sates off an excellent work, and that good feelings come from this. Tama Kwetsi Snachum, those are my words. Chen Quinman told me I'm grateful and thankful to all of you for allowing me to share a bit of time with you today. And I say, top left, love from my heart, peace, air hugs, Wachayap yo, you take care.
Thank you so much, Elder Sequalia. My name is Travers, and I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at SFU. I would like to begin by thanking all of the partners who are supporting this event: CBC Vancouver, the SFU Faculty Association, the SFU Department of Sociology and Anthropology, the SFU Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, the SFU Labor Studies Program, SFU Public Square, and Massey Books. And thanks so much to SFU Public Square in particular for doing all the organizational work for this event. But I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us this afternoon. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know who you are and where you're joining us from. Before we get going, I have a few housekeeping notes. First of all, there is closed captioning available for today's event. You can turn it on and off by clicking the CC button on the black bar at the bottom of your screen. It should be on your right. I want to let you know that we will be recording this event and sharing it so that others who couldn't make it in the moment can benefit from this discussion. But we are only recording video and audio of the speakers and moderator, so there will be no audience images or audio recorded. As we engage with each other through the chat and the Q&A today, please remember to follow our community guidelines, which you can see on this slide as well as in the chat. There will be zero tolerance for those who promote discrimination or harm against others. Anyone who incites harm towards other participants will be removed at the discretion of our technical team and moderator. If you need any technical assistance throughout the event, please message our panelists through the chat, and someone from the SFU Public Square team will get back to you. Now on to the event itself. This event is my brainchild. The onset of the COVID pandemic has reshaped our daily lives in quite radical ways, as all of us know. But one of the things that became clear to me early on is that it has widened existing social inequalities in truly troubling ways. One of the obvious ways is that the already heavy burdens on parents in general and mothers in particular have increased to a tremendous extent. The lack of means to manage these extra burdens have hurt mothers a lot, particularly those without financial security. The impact of COVID on mothers has both immediate and long-term consequences that are important for us to understand and to try to mediate. My colleague, Amanda Watson, a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at SFU, is uniquely positioned to help us make sense of the impact of COVID on mothers. Her book, The Juggling Mother, Coming Undone in the Age of Anxiety, came out just at the beginning of the pandemic and speaks to the demands on mothers to manage paid work and unpaid care work in such a way as to make it all look easy and graceful, expectations that are impossible for even the most privileged mothers to meet, but that are particularly harmful to socioeconomically disadvantaged mothers. The wonderful Michelle Eliot, the host of the call-in show BC Today on CBC Radio One, brings both professional and personal experience to this topic. Michelle was kind enough to agree to my invitation to participate in this conversation, and we are incredibly lucky to have her here with us today. SFU Public Square and I chose to hold this event on International Women's Day because of its significance in celebrating the power of women organizing for social justice. March 8th emerged as the globally accepted day to celebrate IWD in the context of first wave feminist and socialist feminist organizing in Europe, the Soviet Union, and the USA in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. Today's conversation is intended to be part of this tradition of organizing for social justice. When we fight for social justice for all mothers, not just the mothers we are taught to believe are the good mothers, we all benefit. Let me tell you how today's event is going to work. Amanda Watson will be reading excerpts from her book, pausing between each passage to engage in conversation with Michelle Eliot. At the end of this reading and conversation, I will pose some questions from our audience. If you would like to ask Amanda or Michelle a question, you can type your question into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any point during the discussion. Now it's time to turn it over to Amanda and Michelle. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Travers, and thank you to SFU Public Square, Seth, Janet, Rachel, Kim, Cassandra, and thank you to Elder Sequoia for starting us off in a good way. That was a very inspiring prayer, and I'm thinking about those words as I think about what I wrote here and how those weren't the words that were racing through my head as I entered motherhood and the job market. So I thought I'd begin with a reading that's a bit on the personal side at the beginning of the book, just to get us intimate and just get there. Here we go. When I found out I was pregnant, even though it was intentional, I felt ambivalent. I wanted to have a family, but I did not want to become a mother. After some anxious reflection, made more unsettling by the precarity of being a pregnant body on the academic job market, I attributed my doubt to both a lifetime of responsibly tended internalized misogyny and fear that gendered labor and its related resentments would defeat me upon having a baby. Acknowledging this could not mitigate the numbness of postpartum depression, which came in dense waves following the birth of my first child. Through the postpartum period, I was haunted by the misogynist cliche that mothers are most suited to be bearers of nature and not creators of culture. I was tired and often alone with a mercurial newborn. He cried a lot. I was no longer able to think in a sustained manner about abstract ideas the way I so often had before becoming pregnant. I became susceptible to missing appointments and dropping correspondence. Tears of release never came, so I waited through solitary days with little awareness of myself. My partner was supportive, but I was oftentimes unreachable. Despite having studied the insidious and disciplinary features of the institution of contemporary motherhood for years, I felt myself attempting to perform a kind of motherhood that was ironically aloof and even detached and cynical, but also innately capable, proficient at care work, while quick with a dismissive joke about the sometimes intense minutia of pumping breast milk in the middle of the night or carrying a dehydrated newborn through a rainstorm to the emergency room. Feminist intellectual sensibility certainly animated my reflections throughout this time, but they could not exempt me from visions of productivity, efficiency, independence, resilience, and flexibility that I had so long criticized, but still so diligently pursued. As a privileged Canadian academic with a benefits package that includes up to a year of combined maternity and parental leave, I had planned on applying my scholarly discipline to this time away from the university. I thought I could sufficiently dote on the infant during his waking hours and turn my attention to cultivating my intellect and spirit during naps. I realize now how this sounds, especially to parents whose babies scoff at napping as mine did. But at the time, the question of why I couldn't even open one of the dozens of books I had stockpiled for this absence from academic work consumed me. Why couldn't I read a book? Why couldn't I even remember to feed myself? Would my brain recover? And what would that feel like? In hindsight, I was describing brain fog here. I just didn't know what to call it because we hadn't had the pandemic yet. As I prepared to go back to work, to the extent that preparation for this is possible, I would daydream about how to secure my reputation as someone who could skillfully juggle my first year of new course preparations and life with a new baby. I envisioned myself floating stylishly through the corridors of higher learning, taking on meetings with a smile to convey the ease with which I was conducting my responsibilities. Though I was mindful of the layers of irony involved in trying to advance radical ideas about liberating motherhood while personally attempting to conceal its messiness, I could not resist conforming to the performance of the talented juggling mother. If I had to be read as a new mother in my new place of work and surely breast pump and puffy eyes would give me away, I wanted to be known as being profoundly competent and even striking in my emotional stability. I wanted my colleagues to know how hard I was working and that they could trust my work to be stellar despite my family status. Maybe I even wanted to intimidate them. When I became pregnant for a second time, I felt these emotional tensions intensify, it was time for performances of rejecting my body, of concealing my growing belly, of denying my fatigue, of leaning in to more professional activities than one person should reasonably manage. When I betrayed my pregnant status, I attempted to assure my colleagues in numerous ways, usually through self-deprecating humor, that I was capable of responding to my body while never reducing my productive capacity. Michelle, are you out there?
I sure am, and I think you can see me. I wasn't sure if you could see me, but I've got my camera on, and I'm pretty sure Seth has changed the view. Amanda Watson, wonderful opening to your book. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. I'm kind of in awe that I'm able to talk to you right now, because I'm so used to hearing your show on the radio. So I'm just so excited. Thanks very much for being here. Oh, no, it's my pleasure. And thank you to Travers. It was such an honor to be invited by them to do this with you. This, it's something I experienced. What you just read is so relatable. And I just wanted to tell you actually about when I read your book and the moments when I read your book, because I was kind of walking around the house, carrying it around with me. I would be sitting in the hallway waiting for my daughter to finish getting ready in the washroom. I remember standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for toast, and just kind of holding the book while I was waiting for the toast. And I'd have it in my hand while I was chatting with my son about his day at school. So, when you talk about juggling, yeah, I get it. But it's not exceptional, right? That's something that is such a common experience to varying levels, of course, but generally a very pervasive experience. And in the book, you paint a picture for us of that prevailing image of the juggling mother in our society. Can you describe what that looks like? Yes, sure. First of all, I just love that image of this book. Being part of the mess, being part of the mess. Yeah, I love that. So the juggling mother is, of course, not a real person. She's a trope. She's who we imagine when we close our eyes and we think about the person who is fully expended in their devotion to paid work and unpaid work. So she's the person who you trust to she's busy at work, but you'll give her more and she'll never drop the ball at work. And she's definitely doing the right things in the home as well. Responding to the latest on child psychology in terms of how much screen time we should be giving, and child nutrition, and all of these expert advice. Yeah, so she's never going to drop the ball at home, and she won't make decisions that are a threat to her kids. And so we know that life is much messier than this, but I saw this trope again and again in popular culture and in traditional media representations, even public health campaigns. And the thing about the juggling mother that fascinated me is the sort of coming undone aspect. So at first, coming undone for me meant to capture the real feelings that women report having when they're trying to reconcile the irreconcilable and do what is too much to do, and like that role strain. And it was described by women in the literature, and to me, as soon as I would tell people what I was studying, as a kind of like too muchness, an emotional overwhelm, mix of anxiety and depression and stress that kind of ebbs and flows throughout the day, depending on the task or what goes awry. And at the same time, I also felt that pull to its performance. And by performance, I don't mean like playing pretend. I don't mean that it's fake or that we're being deceitful, but that I felt a sort of need to show that I was kind of edging against burnout all the time, like constantly doing the most in order to kind of avoid the motherhood stigma or motherhood penalty at work. I just that conditioning kind of kicked in for me upon having kids, that like, okay, well, if mothers are seen as being like about their kids first and therefore less reliable at work and less productive, then I want to be the one to sort of like rise above that by performing this like competence above all things. So it's a really ableist kind of trope that reinforces hierarchies, because the juggling mother who's aiming for this kind of reputation is not looking around. It's not an activist mom, right? She's not ruffling the feathers of people who have power. She's not dismantling status quo hierarchies. She's playing the game and trying to play it better than others. She's snugly within the status quo and the norms, of our institutions.
And who was left out in that image then of the juggling mother? Who are we not thinking about?
We typically see in media representations this mother inflected with whiteness, be it white skin or kind of a middle class motherhood that has like a kind of American dream sensibility, that's like pulling a family up, like taking responsibility for the health and well-being of a family. And so we don't see mothers who have like, gig work upon like shifts upon shift and taking public transit between shift work and things like that. Like we often see representations of like the CEO or like the journalist or the professional athlete, people who have exceptional means and physical ability and mental capacity. So I think everyone is left out of this, because even the person with the the most access to power and the most privileged social position is unfairly burdened. Like this is a sad state for that person, but she's also doing harm by not activating against the structures that put her there. So I think that's the controversial bit. It's an invitation to think about the ways in which we are complicit in the way our work is organized, but also that unfairly burdened, exhausted, spent, especially in the context of the pandemic.
Yeah, and you say controversial. That is one of the words that's used in some of the material to describe your book. I mean, do you expect pushback to that argument? That this it's one thing to say the system is demanding too much of women, but there are certain women of privilege who reinforce and perpetuate that system.
I think I was expecting more pushback, but I wrote this a few years ago. Yeah, I wrote it a couple of years ago, and I think partly in inserting the memoir and like exposing like my own kind of struggle to burn the systems down, because I just want to fit in and I just want to be recognized and included, like socially and politically, and valued and idolized in this way. I think maybe disarmed, people who may have found that unsympathetic to just how hard their work really is, even in privileged social positions. But I also think that, speaking of the summer, there's just been more of a cultural reckoning around the ways in which white supremacy wields itself through our institutions. So I think it landed at a time when people have been interested in the message. Mm-hmm. And so I think less pushback than I would have expected before that.
And what has the pandemic that is overriding so much of our lives now, what has it revealed about the demands on mothers?
I think we can't deny this anymore. And I'm cynical typically and critical, and studied, the second shift, when at the beginning of my academic career, which had description from the 70s and 80s about how women who work for pay then go to the home and work their second shift. I saw someone give a shout out to that author, Arlie Hochschild, in the chat. I see you. I think that, to me, when I was like an undergraduate student, even, this problem was well known, like the problem of women doing more, especially mothers who have children or elder care responsibilities. And it just was like sitting there. It was just stubborn and entrenched. And we would talk about it once a year on International Women's Day or something. And then suddenly the conditions of work have been getting worse, right? Like gig work and precarious work and the erosion of unions. And then the pandemic hit, and suddenly I think the juggling mother couldn't do that anymore. Like the facade cracked. My friend, I told my friend this morning, like, it's like we were juggling and then someone threw on an elephant, and she was like, and everything's on fire. She's like it's so my optimism, I guess, with respect to what's coming out of COVID, is that we're now in a mental health crisis that is calling us to attend to the ways in which we assume some people in our families will pick up the slack no matter what. And that's certainly what we've seen. We've seen women pivot to unpaid work without being asked, right, in crisis management mode. And now we are seeing the data on their disproportionate mental health crisis. And I just think we can't look away. And I'm seeing it in headlines in a way that I've never seen it before. Like if I were to write the book again, I would look at the headlines over the past year and ask what story that's telling about how we value care work or we don't, and what we expect of women in paid and unpaid work.
Yeah, I've read some pieces you've written since the pandemic started about, being at school, and I think it was about your daughter sliming your jeans or something like that.
Yeah. She's Zoom bombing. Like, people are Zoom bombing.
I mean, it is the daily reality. I've done, the same, and I was doing the show from home. And in the early days of the pandemic, and at the end of the show, I'd go back to the dining room and do homework with my kids, and so it was certainly the reality so many of us were faced with. Where do you think were the holes, and where are the gaps that we have seen through the pandemic?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, obviously, a lot of people can't work from home, so we're talking about like flexible work that was already more flexible than if you're working in delivery or food service or cleaning and hospitality and that kind of thing. Okay, so something that I'm a little bit nervous about, I would say, is a gap, and that is we're seeing when men and women in heterosexual partnerships both work from home, it's like women's load is still doubling. And there was that great picture in the New York Times last weekend or the weekend before that showed this like father in the office checking his email and working hard, and like I think he had multiple part-time jobs, and we see this mother, and she's on a conference call like in her earbuds, and she's doing like the toileting with the toddler. And it was just like, yeah, those are the gaps. Like how if we're all at home now, and this paid work and unpaid work has newly become relegated to what we sometimes think about as the private sphere. Now, where are our opportunities to like keep it public and say, like, how are these divisions of labor shaking out? So I guess that's something that makes me a little nervous, is like how is our conditioning and our default assumptions about who's doing what in the home going to get better if what we saw is the same pattern that existed before COVID, like the exact same rate of like the ratio of work between parents repeat itself. It just got, everyone's plate just got more full, but the patterns are the same.
Was magnified. Yeah. I know you're going to read a passage about Sheryl Sandberg in just a moment. You mentioned the corporate mother that seems to be part of our image of the juggling mother. And Sheryl Sandberg, the chief operating officer of Facebook, who so famously told women to lean in. Can you set up for us what Sheryl Sandberg represents for you and that message of leaning in?
Yes, thank you for that question. This was a person who came across my radar when I was at the beginning of my PhD. And so when this message before she wrote the book and called it Lean In, I was excited, honestly, like sitting at the edge of my chair watching her TED Talk, thinking this enormously powerful person who has, against all odds, become a leader in Silicon Valley, which we know is like a really misogynist culture and male dominated in leadership. And what is she going to say? Like, is she going to call them out? And then she did the opposite. It was very much about, hey, women, these are the ways that you can comport yourselves to fit in a male-dominated environment. And I'm hard on her as an individual case because she just represents a message that we see again and again come from that kind of like what's called executive feminism. And I mean, she has since responded to critique and I think nuanced her projects, but it just kind of is like this example par excellence of how when we have these like capitalist profit motives trying to dovetail with feminism, it just is totally incoherent, and it puts the onus on individual women to change their own behaviors, which I find infuriating. And I just want to protect like my students from hearing things like that, so that they don't internalize that extra responsibility.
We are going to hear from the book right now. Amanda Watson, once again, reading from The Juggling Mother, Coming Undone in the Age of Anxiety.
Thanks very much. So this is from a chapter called C-Suite Moms, and that means mothers in CEO or COO or CFO positions. When I began graduate work in feminist and gender studies in 2010, just got to get out of this screen here. There we go. Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg gave what would become her tremendously popular 15-minute TED Talk. There we go. Why we have too few women leaders. In her lecture, she told an audience of women in blazers that we had a major problem. Women were not making it to the top of any profession anywhere in the world. A sister problem, she argued, was that women face harder choices than men do when it comes to professional success and personal fulfillment. By personal fulfillment, she meant motherhood. Regarding the problem of personal fulfillment, Sandberg admitted that she did not have the answer, though she knew well the feeling of her daughter wrapped around her leg, begging through tears for her not to get on the plane. In referring to this moment, where tears are implied but never shed publicly, Sandberg ushered in a kind of corporate femininity that mandates juggling but forecloses coming undone. The problems she underscored were familiar by then, but rather than discussing known ways out, like universal childcare programs, parental leave, pay equity legislation, Sandberg spent the rest of her talk explaining women's self-defeating habits. She admitted to feelings of coming undone that were strong enough to soften her business acumen, but then pivoted expertly to shrewd strategies we can deploy to keep it together. Although she advocated for women's career success, Sandberg was careful not to comment on structural discrimination or disadvantage. Instead, she said it was the individual woman's responsibility to sort out her learned behaviors. I'm paraphrasing. Even though Sandberg's talk centered on women's squeezed position between work and family responsibilities and the emotional burden women inherit as a result of striving for success in both realms simultaneously, she attributed no material cause or solution to the phenomenon, and she avoided naming it. In neglecting to discuss structural oppression and institutionalized inequity, as well as the complicated and often precarious status of mothers in paid employment, Sandberg was careful not to ruffle the feathers of anyone who currently has power, quite the opposite. Sandberg is the superlative juggling mother. She reveals the tender intimacies of her colliding labors, but does not induce skepticism about her priorities or skills. Her wardrobe is perfect. It adheres to the tailored lines of respectability while she teeters atop designer heels. We trust Sandberg to make the right decisions, and she is not alone in highlighting mothers' conflicting responsibilities from the perspective of affluent, high-achieving corporate women. She has come to represent what Joan Williams and Rachel Dempsey have dubbed the rise of executive feminism. Her book, Lean In, now famous, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead, became an instant bestseller with reviews and commentary in major newspapers and talk shows around the world. So the question from critics thus becomes, if Sandberg and friends are struggling to lean in one direction or another, what does this mean for women with far fewer resources or supports? And adding to the mystique of Sandberg's project, she is outspoken about her identification with feminism. So what does it mean to encourage mothers toward corporate success as a form of feminism? This question is ringing loud in my ears today on International Women's Day. Fundamentally, the juggling mother is flexible and she is striving. Since mothers in particular may invite stigma if they take advantage of flexible workplace policies, they themselves must become flexible. In addition to being adaptable to multiple labors, the C-suite mother looks and thinks ahead. She invests in her family and herself in the present and anticipates the future care needs of others and her next financial opportunity. She represents the sped up pace of life, which is uniquely felt by elites. And even though it is full of stressful demands, her time is worth lots and lots of money. She works to experience the pleasure of buying the most out of life during her leisure time. Her body and mind are supple, her labor transnational. She works on her phone while waiting for her flight to land and outsources the kind of care work that is not so pliant. The Silicon Valley C-suite mother in particular reflects the flexibility of famously happy workplace cultures where all kinds of personal maintenance and care labor, laundry, cooking, driving, exercising, physical therapy is included on site to promise workers a more flexible life. These flexible bodies are not caring bodies. Care work does not aggregate like messages in an inbox or line up like a series of timed meetings. And flexibility and agility are demanded of C-suite mothers in particularly sexist, racist, and ableist ways that are also tied to their ability to make smart consumer choices in their personal lives. On-the-go fair trade snacks, organic clothing, yoga classes, a mindfulness practice, routine doctor's appointments, a summer home, and a safe, energy-efficient SUV. The capacity to make these choices is particularly classed, of course, as low-paying jobs are less likely to provide flexible hours, paid vacation, or paid days off. So rather than offering legitimate feminist critique, flexible bodies responding to flexible work reproduce hierarchies of care, as outsourcing care to a global care chain, or insourcing, we could say, remains a privileged way to pass on the responsibility for care. Oh, I don't hear you yet, Michelle. I think you're, there we go.
I'm exhausted just hearing all of that. It's such a snapshot, but you know, it's so interesting to me that description and who that is afforded to, you know, those kinds of choices. And that line really stuck out for me as well. If Sandberg and friends are struggling to lean in one direction or another, what does this mean for women with far fewer resources and supports? Can you expand on that a little? Like, what would be the consequences for women who have fewer supports and resources when they come undone?
I think, oh, that's a good question. Like when they come undone. This is impossible. Like Sandberg we only get what the media shows us of her story. It's obviously like a highly curated image of a person because that's part of her brand and her success. But I think both the fact that this person exists and this trope exists, it puts invisible pressure, I think, on women to aspire to something that's impossible. Like it de-emphasizes the incompatibility of the work. So that's the first thing I would say about that. But the second thing is, I think if Sandberg or her contemporaries, or even myself, if I were to make a mistake, it's not likely, given my social position, that like child services is going to suspect that I'm irresponsible. Like there are certain privileges that allow some women, in like affluent women and women with race and class privilege, to come a little bit undone and make certain kinds of jokes and that other women can't make, for fear of stigma, for fear of losing their job or losing access to their kids in real ways, or just like, that threaten the survivability of their families. So an example that I was thinking of the other day is like when I walk into a meeting and my colleague says, "How are you?" I can say, "Oh man, I did not sleep last night. My daughter did not sleep last night. I'm on my fourth coffee and we'll just see how this goes." And that's a way that I can perform my identity, right? Like not in a fake way, like that could be legitimate, but I can get away with that and we can have like a nice rapport. And it is a way that I like build my identity through that conversation. And I wouldn't say things like, "I couldn't get up this morning because I was so depressed, so I had to take several a cocktail of medication, and then I like couldn't even, get my kids together. So but I'm here." Like there are some jokes I wouldn't make because that crosses the line of what is acceptable with respect to like responsible juggling mothers. So that's sort of, so I think some mothers just can't afford the privilege to appear to be coming undone. Their performance needs to be much tighter.
And so when it comes to the system, for racialized, for queer, for marginalized, for disabled mothers, what needs to change there?
Oh, whenever I think about, I would recommend a radical overhaul of how we organize family life. I think there was a headline at the beginning of COVID that was like, "The nuclear family is a sham," and I was like, yes, like never have I felt this more, since our networks were cut off and we're all in our little boxes, trying to do the work of like a village. It really laid bare, I think, the flaws in the way we've organized families to be these little siloed little units of responsibility. So I would recommend, I guess, like more universal policy to sort of level playing fields. So like childcare and especially universal, affordable, high quality, diverse, and accessible childcare. Housing, right? We're in a housing crisis and a childcare crisis and an opioid crisis in Vancouver. So I think there's a lot that we can do, officially speaking, with respect to how we allocate our resources in society. And then I think it's going to take some discomfort on the part of people who have power to think about the ways in which they can give it away. Because that's how it's going to have to happen, I think. Like there's going to have to be mutual aid initiatives that challenge the way that the rich get richer, and that that keep family hierarchies intact.
And when you talk about that discomfort, we talked about pushback earlier. Last week on our show, we actually discussed 24-hour childcare centers. Because there's one coming to Kitimat, and the city of Vancouver is pursuing the idea as well of 24-hour or extended hour childcare, and that was a motion put forward by Councillor Melissa DiGenova. And we got some people saying, yes, that would make such a difference for me, especially shift workers, for example. We're hearing so much about them throughout this pandemic, but also a reaction that we shouldn't be relying on the government for everything, in particular childcare. What's your reaction to that? What's your response to that?
Typically, I think that pushback hinges on this notion of choice. We often hear critics of universal programming say that that kind of investment in childcare takes the choices away from families. And I think that's like a really sneaky myth, because in fact, it provides the conditions that more families can choose what they can do with respect to childcare. And so I think there's like a lot of myth busting that needs to happen around providing accessible childcare would do. And I think often what the ministers involved in this have to respond to is people saying, well, what if I don't want to send my kids to a big center? I think what they're saying is like, we are going to research and find ways to provide childcare. That doesn't mean that everybody drops their 6-month-old off in a gymnasium with 30 other 6-month-olds. These could be in homes. There could be different settings for different personal ability and cultural needs. And I would just love to see that happen. This is definitely like a hill that I will die on, is the accessible and affordable childcare fight, because like research has shown for decades and decades that not only does it narrow the income gap, like the socioeconomic status gap between mothers, but between children as well, and between families. So it's just one of those like major social policy pieces that is a total no-brainer. And so I think, yeah, just like demystifying the language of choice around that, the way like it's not stripping choice. And if we don't provide it universally, then we see a kind of stigmatization of the use of it the way we do when other public systems, like public school in the US, for example, the public school systems are not as strong because there's like such a privatized culture of education. And so families of a certain means think that the better thing to do is to go to private schools. And then we see funding drawn even further from education. So I think, yeah, let's like think about the fact that it needs to be universal to get everybody's investment in keeping it high quality.
Do you see the needle moving on that because of the pandemic, on that discussion?
I have seen a lot of it over the past year, and I don't know if it's because of the pandemic or because of because this government really campaigned on it here in BC. I'm not seeing a lot from the federal government, and that's discouraging. I think in a lot of ways, we did not center childcare and schools in the pandemic, nationally speaking. Although I do think that in BC, we've seen more of a prioritizing of those needs and a recognition of the social science literature that says we need to keep schools open and we need to keep daycares open.
We're going to hear more now about resistance and ways to find systemic change in our next reading. More from Amanda Watson, The Juggling Mother, Coming Undone in the Age of Anxiety.
The morning I gave birth to my daughter, I was on my couch counting contractions. I've just got to pop out of the full screen mode here. Listening to my husband furiously clacking out of office notes at the desk next to me. I was thinking about the ways to ask my community for help as my labor progressed. I was consciously hoping to resist the urge to maintain this reputation as the ultimately productive, unencumbered individual, especially at the moment of giving birth, to ask for help, as they say. I thought I would try. Scrolling through my phone between contractions, I was roused by insecure and competitive feelings when I paused on an Instagram post. The photo showed a mother appearing to have a constructive maternity leave. She was cooking healthy food in a clean, bright kitchen. She was reading a dense-looking book about perfecting the art of sourdough. And remember, I wrote this before the pandemic, so I was already into feeling inadequate based on my sourdough baking skills. In the caption, she joked about not having washed her hair in days. Very funny, I thought. The oxytocin cascading from within me was for a moment blocked by pangs of fear that I would never be enough. Of course, I did not act on these bad feelings by, say, sending her a mean note about her green smoothies and scratch cooking. I did not want this woman to fail, but I perhaps wanted to know if she shares my feelings of fear. Really, I just wanted to be able to guarantee that my own family could keep up. And because I'm interested in being rewarded for generating positive affect myself, the negative energy rumbling here morphed into a desire to achieve this distant acquaintance's performance of competence, of coming undone in busy service to capitalist productivity and service to my family. I cannot deny the feelings that orient me and no doubt orient all of us toward and away from one another in times when solidarity is required. It is helpful to admit that I felt defensive because I felt afraid. But I remain optimistic about the power of feminists to form assemblages of emotional solidarity. They may take the form of a wink or a smile in the daycare parking lot, or more traditionally of a hot meal, a load of laundry, or a trip to the clinic in times of need. They might take the form of asking for help, or of realizing that self-care is better imagined as community care, of inviting a friend over for tea, even or especially if the house feels dirty or embarrassing, of lying in bed with a magazine while a male friend or partner does the caring, of admitting anxiety or self-hatred or self-harm, of killing the joy of men and others who need an education on caring labor. Imagine. They might mean thinking about why we feel in some moments so insecure and in others so empowered, educating ourselves on the experiences of other families, severing our worth from the abilities of our children, and challenging our internalized notions of success and failure. Feminists have always built communities, and our long resume of reaching out and checking in on the well-being of others can only serve a mandate of advancing radical emotional support. I used to hang my optimism on my own ability to juggle. This was misguided. But can we really resist the pressure to show we are doing everything productively, down to how we spend our leisure time in the concerted cultivation of our offspring? In dreaming about how to live and die well with each other, from Donna Haraway in 2016, I fantasize about the transformative potential of emotional solidarity among mothers and queer parents in particular. Far from being individualist work, this solidarity means we must find our power and trust in the anti-capitalist collective action that women, particularly Black and Indigenous women and trans folks who have been required to fight for the survival of their families, have never stopped doing. We find it in midwifery collectives, abortion clinics, cross-border labor movements, disability justice work from beds and phones, and online, in-person, anti-fascist organizing that fights to reconnect families displaced through incarceration, border wars, climate crisis, and gentrification. This is a world where people have been hurt are uplifted. This is a world that rejects closet mothering, where women cry alone in cars and kitchens because it is all too much, and centers caring as the measure of our responsibility to one another. Thank you.
I remember to unmute this time. A lot of that is so powerful, and for myself as a journalist, educating ourselves in the experience of other families. I mean, that's what we do is tell the stories of families and mothers in this case, and learning about their experiences. And that line about emotional solidarity as well is so resonant, because I know for myself, I find some of the most valuable conversations I've had with other mothers have been, I guess it's also partly the support, but also sharing tips. Like, how do you deal with potty training? And I know that on some level you feel like that again is just so individualistic that it puts onus on individual mothers. But what's the value? Do you see value in that, in sharing tips and advice to just deal with the everyday challenges?
I totally do. And it's amazing. And I think this is why we're all cracking in COVID right now, and why our mental health is so bad. It's because those connections, regardless of whether or not they're about parenting, just help us feel seen, right? Like, these are real social needs. And when you're parenting and going through something very stressful, it can feel like you're the only one who is going through it, right? It can feel very isolating. And then you turn to the internet, and that makes matters much, much worse, typically. So I think like, yeah, I really miss that. Seeing parents in the parking lot and things like that. Like, all it takes is someone to sort of like look you in the eye and smile and be like, oh my gosh, I remember that sleep regression, or I remember that potty training going sideways. And then suddenly it feels normal. It feels like this is a community effort, and it's empowering, totally life-giving and life-changing. And that is like, really, I do feel hopeful there, because I think that we have a lot in common when we're just trying to raise kids in precarious and anxious times. And so it's not hard to find solidarity in those moments. Childcare and elder care, care work in general is messy, and it's humorous, right? And it's stressful, and it's hard. And when it's invisible, it can be a burden and painful. But when it's at the surface and it's just part of, keeping our bodies alive and functioning and keeping our society happy, it's great. It's like so nurturing and life-giving itself. Yeah.
That reminds me, I was at the clinic a couple of weeks ago, and there was a mom there with three little kids, and they were, running around the waiting room. And I knew what she was thinking, and I was trying to keep my distance for COVID reasons. And I think, and she kind of turned and said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "Oh no, don't apologize. I've been there. I'm just keeping my distance for, to physically distance." But it's amazing what difference that can make. And it just brought me right back to when my kids were running around in public places and turning to apologize and hoping people would understand. So there's that, again, that solidarity. Finally, what gives you optimism? You started off telling us about, how this was personal for you. What gives you optimism?
I mean, I think it is when I connect with other parents like that, and when I can tell that whatever alienation we might have internally or sense of competition with one another that we may feel, it's just not there. It just doesn't feel like it's there when I connect with my friends, and I can see the effort that we're making to just be in like presence with each other and to validate one another. Like I'm really struck by, especially since the book came out, how many like podcasts and blogs and like online spaces and community spaces are built by mothers in particular, and are dedicated to validating each other's experiences and providing support, whether through tips or actual, resources, rides to the clinic and that kind of thing. So I am really optimistic. And I think the other thing that is COVID specific is that like this conversation feels a lot more acceptable today than I think it may have a year ago, because I think it has become more acceptable to say the care work that I'm doing is too much. It feels unnatural to be the only one responsible for these children, and it's driving me crazy, and my mental health is suffering. And so that gives me a lot of optimism. I've been way more honest with some of my friends, some of my child-free friends even, than I think I was being a year ago. So I'm really clinging to that. Got to have hope where there's no hope. So yeah.
Not having to perform that everything is okay.
Just let the guard down. It feels really good.
What a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It was such a pleasure.
We've come to the end of our conversation here, but I know that there are many questions coming in, and I want to welcome back Travers, who has been fielding all of them.
I'm excited to ask these questions. But before, of course, I have to ask my own question. Somewhere back in, I think 1992, Tanya Schechter published a book about domestic labor in Canada. And the argument she made was that white, middle, and upper class women have been able to participate in the public sphere, meaning leave the domestic sphere, participate in the public sphere, not because there's been any change in the way in which domestic and childcare labor is allocated, but because we've hired replacement women, meaning women who are poor and or racialized, etc. Now, do you see any, has there been any change since 1992? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I just saw it recently corrected from outsource that labor to insource. It was Harsha Walia in her new book, thinking about the way that we mandate migrant labor and transnational labor to keep the Western economy and nation states functioning. Some changes. I mean, the Canadian Live-In Caregiver Program was effectively canceled. So it was originally a huge investment on the part of the government to recruit people from around the world to come in and pinch hit, and I think that went awry, and that it was filled with violence and various abuses of power and a lack of communicating women's rights to them. Issues that you're no doubt familiar with in any kind of temporary foreign worker context. But I don't think that we've sufficiently unearthed the story of how we require that for middle-class families. We either default to the expectation that women will burn themselves out doing unpaid work. We just assume that families will solve this for themselves. And so and then we have the problem of women feeling guilty for doing this and that, but the economy required two-parent families to survive. because through the 70s and 80s, you know, through transnational like globalization and competition, that's what families needed to do, and real wages have stagnated. And so I think often what we hear chalked up to or like blamed on, depending on the context, feminism is sort of not sufficiently underscoring the fact that this was an economic requirement for many families. And so, yeah, like that's what I try to underscore to my students, that we're still in this mess, and it's not feminism's fault. You know, this the global care chain is there for a reason.
Thank you. I'm just going to scroll through the Q&A. I want to apologize to the audience. I won't be able to ask all the questions. So if I don't choose yours, please understand. Here's one from Janice. Amanda, this is, you know, mostly for you, but Michelle, please join in, because this is a really interesting question. Like, what about mothers who leave their families, who don't juggle, who abandon? And even abandon is like so value laden, but what about mothers who leave their families, who, you know, in the face of these multiple demands, just say,
Oh, so not in terms of migrant labor, but well, I think that's a relatable revenge fantasy. No, I've never thought about that, I have to admit. Mothers who leave their family. So you mean in terms of divorce or that kind of thing?
Well, I think in Western culture, it's like the worst thing that you can do is leave your family, although we've certainly tolerated men doing that for generations.
Yes, right.
Whereas women opting out of parenting their offspring is like an absolute sin.
One of the things that I try to nuance in the book is that what the Juggling Mother helps us understand is that it's not like you can do a little bit of care work and a little bit of paid work. Like this ideal subject mandates both this nurturant caregiver that's like a well of love and support and willing, like a willing laborer of love, and also a diligent and dedicated employee. So while I think there is an argument to be made that the trope of the housewife who dedicates herself only to her children and domestic work has shifted, like this represents a shift from 70 years ago, say, we haven't taken away those kind of expectations of femininity. So even in the upper echelons of power, like Sheryl Sandberg represents, we expect some feminine softness and some performance of the fact that she would never leave her children or be a threat to her children. Like that is still very much expected and idolized. So I think that women who leave their children we just don't compute in our culture. We don't have a script for that, and that they face a ton of stigma. I can't imagine trying to tell that story in our cultural repertoire.
So there's this tension between not seeming to be influenced by your caregiving responsibilities as a mother and being loving and devoted. And it's impossible. It's an impossible combination.
Yeah, it's definitely like a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of position. It's untenable.
Yes. One question that I think is quite interesting. I mean, I've long referred to women in heterosexual relationships, particularly with children, as on the front lines of feminism, because, you know, they're doing that kind of work. How does one fight this fight in relationships on the home front? Like if we look at families as, you know, institutions, like how do women do this, ensure that equitable you know, labor arrangements occur?
Oh man, okay, so we could just go for coffee and talk about this for a day probably, because I have lots of ideas about this. So I'll just say one thing. I think it's like carving out a little bit of space for your inner life and thinking about the ways in which we've been conditioned toward a particular kind of femininity that accepts these kinds of divisions of labor as the best we can do. And so, and I mean, I'm not going to, I don't suggest that everyone feels these things equally, but I think it requires that we tap into parts of ourselves. It's like, wait a second, let me think about the ways in which the research bears out that like I have not been socialized to experience anger or express it toward my partner. I've been socialized to accept this division of labor, and accept it with a smile and generate positive feelings in my family, like the magic of birthdays and Christmas, even in COVID times, and not create tension. So I think we need women to create tension and to change the shape of things. And I think that's a really scary idea as a project for a lot of people, because you risk losing things, right? Like if you're going to change the shape of yourself as a puzzle piece in your family puzzle, then other people have to change their shape too, or the puzzle's not going to work out. And I think that's a scary thing in the private domain to negotiate, especially when we know that women are disproportionately facing, violence in the home and power in dynamics like that.
And in the best case
But I
scenario,
think that's a great question.
In the best case scenario, though, what you describe is more labor for women.
Yeah, totally.
Well, and
yeah.
It's such a good question that you pose, Travers. And I would follow up. What then is the role again in heterosexual partnerships? What role is there for the man then to step up in this equation?
I think about that as like two-pronged. The man, both like in a heterosexual dyad where the labor is not being shared equally, has to get ready to get uncomfortable, because that load is real. And if it's going to shift, it's going to take intention and discomfort and, a lack of a giving away of power. But I also think it points to how men need to be ready to be stigmatized in their organizations. Because we know that when men report their, childcare duties at home as the reason that they need to leave the workplace or whatever, like they face a lot of stigma as well. And so, and they just don't do it, and they're not expected to do it to the extent that women need to do it and have no choice in the workplace to be seen as mothers. And so I think it's like, find ways to give your power away at home and realize it's going to be a lot more exhausting than your life was before, but also take a stab at shifting workplace culture that really punishes men like this. They're really trapped at work, I think.
But one of the things we know two things that are interesting. One is that women's standard of living tends to go down after divorce, particularly women with children, whereas men's go up. On the other hand, the amount of domestic labor that women have to do is actually greater when there's a man in the house. Like if you have like 2 or 3 kids and a husband, you're going to do more domestic labor than if the husband leaves. So there's that labor financial security trade-off. But for many women, that's literally like the edge of survival.
Hi, Bobby. Yeah, we can talk about the ways in which all making kind of bargains with our labor for our survival in these conditions.
Yeah. Another question, which is a really good one. Do you have any insights on how we can raise our daughters and all children so we don't pass this down to the following generations?
I've been thinking about how I can try to show my children that I'm a full person as their mother. And my instinct when COVID hit was to protect my kids from seeing me work. And of course, like around the world, kids are alongside their parents while they're working all the time, right? Like this is how we've survived. We make food and our kids run around or whatever. But there was something really like painful for me and that caused a lot of tension when my daughter would, like, they're young, they were 1 and 3 when the pandemic started, when I'd be sort of like ignoring her for a screen. Like this labor in particular just seemed just really gross, like the scrolling of an inbox when she's like learning a word or something. And then I've since shifted, over the course of the year to be thinking about how maybe it's actually a radical change to like chip away at this idea of the mother being fully dedicated to her children and in like a martyrdom kind of way, to say like, hey, I'm excited about this thing I have at work today. So yeah, I'm not dropping you off at daycare today. Someone else is doing that and I'm really gonna miss you, but I'm doing this other thing, and like try to just kind of keep my kids along for the ride. And especially my daughter, because I want her to see herself as a full person, and I'm sure it's going to be it's only a matter of time before the way we condition kids into roles of boys and girls, and like the way we condition our kids in gendered ways acts on her.
Thanks, Amanda. Michelle, do you have anything to add to that?
I can only speak from my own perspective, but I think it's about being role models. And I know I'm the same as Amanda. I try to make sure my kids see me doing different things. And I'm married, and so they make sure that they see their dad, who does a lot of domestic work, actually, doing laundry, doing a lot of the work around the home, and not just that, but also doing a lot of work with the kids, whether it's homework, especially going out for walks and things like that. So it's that like mixing of the roles. And I think if you were to ask them, hopefully they would kind of not really see any delineation as to who's responsible for what. Same with, medical appointments, I think, which are a big thing. Making sure that those are divided. We both are responsible for doctor's appointments and dentist appointments, and we all both have that in our head that's part of our care, that we're responsible for that kind of care. So being in my own house, and my very personal experience, just this being that role model to show that we're, as Amanda said, full human beings, and we're both responsible for your care.
Thank you. Amanda, I'm going to ask another question. What is the value of coming undone in full view?
I think it provides opportunity, like if we're in crisis mode and like we can't look away from this anymore. I really hope I don't have to eat my words here. I really am hopeful that if it is becoming even slightly less stigmatized to admit the extent to which we feel our mental health is waning because of this incoherent slate of labors, that is going to lead to resistance and some kind of labor solidarity between workers and across workers and between parents. Like, I think sometimes it takes a crisis for us to get our acts together with respect to resistance. And I'm just really hopeful that, and I have tried to show this to my students this term and last term and say, I am here for you, but this is also what I'm dealing with. And I'm not going to respond to emails at 4 a.m. anymore. I'm going to set those boundaries, and I'm going to show you as my students how much I value you by not expecting you to email me on the weekends and stuff like that. So just really model that also, I think is really important.
Thank you. A related question from the audience. What do you think is the biggest misconception about being a mother in academia?
Well, that's interesting. I need to think more about that. The biggest misconception. I will be plain about something. I'm not sure if this really responds to the question, but I think at times when I have tried to write or do creative work and like the kind of intellectual work that people imagine us to be doing all the time, when really that is like a really, really small part of what you get to do. But it's like the best part. I can't do that and be a good caregiver. It's just like full stop. I need to shut the door or leave the country or something. Like, it's a really selfish time for me. Like, I need to kind of like observe the world and like often travel or something. And so I do think that people imagine parents to be slotting their work in around their caregiving, like just kind of like sticking it all together. But when it comes to that work, I need to call on my community 100% and say to my partner, like, I can't do caregiving for like 2 full days, like a morning and night or whatever. So that's been an interesting learning experience for me through writing the book. I tried to write most of it alongside my everyday obligations. And then it came to a point last fall where I was like, enough, I'm going to a conference and you were there, Travers, I'm gonna lock myself in my hotel room in order to produce in this way, in this like creative, more artistic way. And I can't do the caregiving at the same time. So that was kind of, I don't know if that answers the question, but something that's interesting and I think unique about academic work. So much is administrative, and then when you try to produce in that way, I think for me, I need to close the door.
Or even the myth of the sabbatical for mothers. Like
Oh
for,
gosh,
okay,
you might know
study
more about that. Yeah, you
Well,
would know more about that than I would.
in order to pull off a sabbatical, you know, the fabulous sabbatical where you get to go to another country, I've never done that for a year. You have to have basically a wife and mother, or you have to be able to outsource your childcare. And so, you know, there are ways in which it's structured. Oh, my son's here, honey. I'm on a Zoom. Look at me. That's kind of fun. Anyway, but yeah, okay. I'm going to go to another question. One of the attendees is asking, where can we learn more about women's work and paid/unpaid labor? Like, are there any particular authors that you recommend to someone who's just like wanting to learn more about this?
I would recommend starting with Silvia Federici. I think her earlier books, Caliban and the Witch, and she's written a lot recently about women in work. Chandra Mohanty's work on borders. I'd recommend Harsha Walia's work, even though it's not about this. It's just a comprehensive view on like border wars, and it's just like so intersectional and complete that I think it gets us thinking about work in a different way. But yeah, Silvia Federici was this like European feminist who is still prolific today, even though she wrote her campaign Wages Against Housework in the 1970s. And she just traces how capitalist society has advanced in such a way that required this labor to be unwaged and done by women in order to support the rest of society. So it's a great primer, and it's really like intellectually and literarily rich.
Thank you. The last question is a short one. It's from a new mom who is too tired, too busy to read. Is the book available as an audiobook?
That's a goal of mine. UBC Press, if you're out there, I'm about to call you about this because I can only listen to audiobooks right now. Yeah, so it's not right now, but maybe stay tuned.
Great. I'm going to wrap things up right now. Thank you, Amanda, so much. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us. You added so much to this conversation. Also, thank you to the audience for the comments you made in the chat and the comments you raised in the Q&A. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. Each question would have been like a wonderful point to depart on. I want to thank the partners for this event, who made this event possible: CBC Vancouver, SFU Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies, the SFU Faculty Association, the SFU Department of Sociology and Anthropology, the SFU Labor Studies Program, SFU Public Square, and Massey Books, letting you know that signed copies of The Juggling Mother are available at Massey Books. And finally, I'd like to thank Elder Sequalia and to all of you for joining us today. This has been a wonderful conversation. Happy International Women's Day.